You will be asked if you have a hat to remove that, and so if you want to check your hair before we get started, make sure that looks good, you can do that. I'd like to ask everybody in here right now to ensure that through this ceremony, your phones are away. And you'll notice that over the course of the year, I've never asked you to do that in an assembly, but in today's assembly, please do that. O Canada today will be sung at the end of our assembly, as is tradition with a Remembrance Day assembly. To start, I'd ask you to remove your hats, stand up as we welcome our flag guard. Please be seated.
Oh man, I'm all sick.
Just a reminder, students, in this assembly, we all give our reverence, which means that there is no conversation. And I ask that you respect that. For 40 minutes a year, we remember and we honor people in our community who serve through various organizations that have already been represented, but also members of staff and family members of our community who have served in military. I'm very proud this morning to acknowledge that we are gathered today on traditional Blackfoot territory, and we are all people of Treaty 7. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land in which we gather on is Treaty 7 territory, the traditional land of Misapi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina. Remembrance Day for all of us is to remember who has served and sacrificed for our country. It's a day we encourage every individual, young and old, to pause, to give thanks, and to remember. Canadians recognize Remembrance Day every November 11th at 11 a.m. It marks the end of the hostilities during the First World War. It's an opportunity to recall all those who served in nation's defense. Today, November 8th, marks National Aboriginal Veterans Day. Indigenous people in Canada have reason to be proud of their wartime contributions, as over 12,000 people served in the First and Second World Wars. And today, November 8th, we honor that. You'll hear later that Indigenous people gave up their rights as Indigenous people to serve Canada. Remembrance Day for me, as an educator and your principal, carries with it personal meaning. I've said to groups before that Terry Fox Day and Remembrance Day for me bring memories of my own childhood in school. And today I want to share a story, part of a story that I've shared before, my first year of principal here at Chinook, of my grandfather. I share this story of my grandfather because when he enlisted for World War II, he was not much older than the students in our school. So my grandfather passed away. I was raised by my grandparents. They're beautiful people. He was my guy. He was a bomber pilot. He flew a Halifax bomber. And he lived in Vancouver with my grandmother, who's still alive and beat me last weekend at cards and trash talked me. It's a true story. When they were first married, my grandfather, an incredibly peaceful man, a near Olympic runner, his life was humble. He was a farmer, went bankrupt, worked as a school caretaker, took care of people in schools, and at the end of his working career, worked in real estate. My grandmother said that he wasn't really good at that. But what he was good at is standing up for things. And when my oldest aunt was born, my grandfather, at the age of 21, tried to enlist. The Canadian government at the time said, "You can't enlist because you have a child." And my grandfather knew that there were so many young men dying in Europe that 3 months later he'd be able to enlist. And he did. And he was a pilot. He flew an aircraft called a Halifax bomber. He got the Distinguished Flying Cross. All of that he only talked to me in his last year of his life because he kept that part of his life quiet. If he was here today, he might remind me that that was one of the most difficult times in his life, is recognizing that he was part of war. In his crew, he had 6 other soldiers, 6 other flightmen who were with him. They called him Pappy because he was the oldest in the crew, 22 years old. The youngest on the crew was called Tex, because he was from Texas. He was a tail gunner. The tail gunner sat at the end of the bomber and shot at any plane trying to knock them out of the sky to kill them. The tail gunner was always the first to be killed. And every time they flew, my grandfather would talk about hoping that Tex made it home. 17. My favorite story is a story that my grandfather told me and said changed his life. They were flying over Germany and they were taking shots into the plane. And they were talking over their headsets, literally worrying that they would not make it. So there was, 22 years old, father of one, wondering if this plane, up in the air, was going to come crashing down. And his navigator, who was sitting beside him, all of a sudden let out a yelp. Ah! pardon my language. He turned to my grandfather and he said, "Pappy, I've been shot in the ass." And the whole crew started to laugh, and certain death became hope. And my grandfather's navigator literally flew the rest of the way back to England with a bullet lodged in his right buttocks. And when they landed, they got him surgery. And what my grandfather said is, in that moment, when that mood lightened and they laughed amongst certain death, that he carried that lesson with him the rest of his life. So thanks for letting me tell that story, because I think each day that I'm here, I carry a piece of my grandfather with me, and his gentleness and his ability to go through difficult things with grace. And that's why Remembrance Day, to me, even though I'm from a generation that was past World War I and World War II, my grandfather and the sacrifices my grandmother made as a single mom, I carry that with me. I'm very happy to welcome Mike Greenstein here today. Mike is a Canadian veteran who served over 22 years in the artillery and then served in the Canadian Air Force in the Persian Gulf. Mike, welcome to our school. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much. On behalf of the Legion, we're very humbled and happy to come to these schools. And when I see my brothers at the Legion, I'll tell them what a beautiful school this was, the people that are here. Thank you. And to the cadets who wore their uniforms with pride, carried the flags of our country and our province, thank you very much. And to the staff who set up everything. And to our distinguished guests as well, who read poetry and stuff like that. It's the time of year we remember and honor those who have served and died for the service of this country, past and present. So what does Remembrance Day mean to me? I will never forget what service was to our vets in the First and Second World War. I've had the opportunity and the honor to meet the odd vet from the First World War, and at the Legion later, sometimes sat and talk to me and tell you an interesting story. And the Second World War is the same, but they've all passed away. And it was always an honor to find out that the story that you heard, they didn't tell anybody else. It's very moving. I think about the people who served in Korea, from the hills to the flight lines, and they have all passed on. And with them, there's some of their stories in my head. One story from an old friend of mine, he talked about he was with the Royal Canadian Regiment, and they were on a hill, they were surrounded, they were cut off from food supplies. So they were just waiting for the attack to come. And it turned out they were getting very hungry. So all they had between him and the guy in the trench with him was 2 bottles of this liquor, which they called Lucky 7. So basically, somewhere along the roadside, they found a peasant, and you took your chances buying this stuff. That's why they called it Lucky 7. So it was meant to be for a day when they could celebrate and get away on R&R. So this is all they had left. So between the two of them, they rationed it out. And roughly they finished off 2 bottles before the attack came. These men weren't alcoholics, they were just starved. And they knew it, they had to eat or drink something. And later on they were attacked. His friend fell down, drunk. he pulled him back into the trench and continued fighting. After the assault was pushed back, their sergeant major charged them both for being intoxicated, and he spent 10 days in hard labor. But he laughs about that, because that's the way it was. You know, we laugh through our hardship. We develop a pretty warm sense of humor sometimes, which we don't necessarily share with the world. I still have friends alive who served in Vietnam. I think about them on Remembrance Day and even today now. This brings me up to a more modern timeline from 1987 to present. My first 4 years was in the 3RCHA. I was a gunner. We trained hard, we played hard in the field, and from time to time we were reminded playing hard and the training could get us killed. We never thought about that. There was sometimes accidents that happened, and we mourned for those accidents. Regardless of whether or not we really like that person or not, and that's honesty. We mourn for him, and we will miss him. That's the way we were. They hated the guy, but he was our brother. We'd stand up for him anywhere. It didn't matter race, creed, or color. On that note, later on, the Canadian government allowed Indigenous soldiers to wear their hair longer. A couple guys, we all laughed about it. They said, well, you should get to have your hair long. And, but we all carried on the same. We were all the same in uniform. We were all brothers and sisters. I changed trades and worked as an aircraft mechanic. And there I experienced the loss of people from squadron and bases. I think the worst part about it is going to a flight safety gear briefing. It's not always easy to go to, because at the briefings, they talk about what happens in the accident, how people die. But the worst part about it is a friend that you listen to on flight data recorder, his last words. There's no fear. It's just they do their best they can until the last minute. Sometimes to save one person on that flight. It's always hard. I was in the Persian Gulf twice, on the back of an air deck, with an air deck with the seaplanes. And the helicopter served us well both times. We had full flight hours, and we're proud to be there. Sometimes it was boring, and then you would have a moment of craziness. On my second trip, the threat level was different, and we had problems with the Arabians because the UN put sanctions on them. So training changed when we were in the Gulf and a lot of other things. We went relatively unscathed, except for a lot of low passes by armed Arabian aircraft. They made sure we knew that they were armed, because they would, as they fly by, they bank their wings so we could see all their armament very clearly. That's how close they were, that they waved to us. And when we left, one of the ships that we served within the Gulf, because during replenishments you do 2-4 ships at a time, so sometimes you'd see these same ships and wave across to the other ship. And just as we left the Gulf, a British ship had their boarding parties. The same job we were doing in the same area. They made a mistake, and their boarding parties got captured for 2 weeks and held prisoners and tortured. It brings home that, wow, maybe we got lucky. And now I'm retired since 2007. I see old friends and talk to people who served and learned their stories and the burdens they've come home with. You know, we finally start recognizing PTSD, and we have a long ways to heal it. And these are young kids, young people, maybe 2 or 3 years older than your grade 12s. And you always feel bad because they're at a point sometimes where they're still not ready to accept the help that they need. And it hurts to see it. and you hope they'll be alive next week or next month. So that's what Remembrance Day means to me. It's not political, it's not religious, it's about brothers and sisters in arms that I shared with and some who died. Thank you very much for your time.
Some of our community who are here with us are unlike me, where my story of remembrance is a generation or two back. Some people like Mike have lived this story, and we have students and families in our community who have counted on Canada reflecting on peace, so that their families can come to a country where we do our very best to look after each other. I'm very proud to invite Joy and Labopo up to read Flanders Field. Yeah, sure.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row in row. At Margaret Place and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below.
We are the dead short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset grow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields.
Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye brave faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
Solomon Ratt is a teacher from Regina, and he wanted to add an Indigenous lens to talking about Remembrance Day in the classroom. Ratt wrote while thinking of his relatives who had to give up their status rights to be able to enlist in the army because they were exempt from conscription under the Indian Act. To read Indian veteran Naima Pine.
We were the forgotten of the less we forgot. We were the invisible ghost from the res. We had no obligation to join. We had to give up our treaty status. We fought, we died. Our language was used for secret messages. We stood side by side with the other soldiers in our victory. We were cast aside when we came back home. We didn't get the other benefits allotted other veterans. We didn't know where to live since we gave up our treaty status. We were the forgotten of the less we forgot. We were the invisible ghost from the res.
Please stand. We will have the last post followed by 2 minutes of silence. Reverend lament. Thank you, Henry. Go on to Wreath Lane. No, we won't. We already did that. At the end of our assembly today, thank you to continue standing. We will sing O Canada together, and to lead us, I invite down Jenna.
Please join me in singing. Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot, with all songs land, with glowing hearts receiving us, the true North strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land, glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
And now we'll exit with our flag guard, so stay standing, please.
Parade attention! Parade! March on! The flag party to retrieve flags!
Flag party! Flag center! Red! March! Cornell! Flag party! Halt!
Parade! Retrieve flags!
Flag party! Retrieve flags!
Flag party! March off the flags!
Flag party! Comes by
you, everybody. I want to say a special thank you to our teachers who organized today, and of course our special guest Mike, students who added to this ceremony. And I want to thank, we will dismiss from this side. Thank you.